The blizzard raged through the abandoned districts with a fury that seemed almost personal, hurling ice crystals like daggers against the boarded windows and rusted fire escapes. Marcus Reed pulled his coat tighter as he watched the storm from his apartment window, the glass trembling under each violent gust. This was the kind of weather that drove even the hardiest souls indoors, where the very air outside seemed hostile to life itself. Marcus had always despised these winter tempests. The cold seeped through every barrier he erected, settling deep in his joints despite the layers of clothing he wrapped around himself. Evenings like this only served to emphasize how hollow his dwelling had become through the passing years. He stood in his cramped kitchen, listening to the microwave's mechanical hum as it warmed his solitary meal, his fingers absently scratching the stubble along his jawline while the wind hammered relentlessly against the glass dot. Then came the knocking three deliberate raps that cut through the storm's howling. Marcus frowned, his hand freezing mid-motion. Nobody ventured out in conditions like these, certainly not in this forgotten corner of the metropolis, and definitely not to visit him. His neighbors kept to themselves with religious devotion, and he had no remaining connections who might appear unannounced. For a heartbeat, he considered pretending he hadn't heard, but something in the rhythm of those knocks, hollow yet desperate, made his instincts prickle with unease. Reluctantly, he abandoned his dinner and approached the door. When he pulled it open, reality seemed to fracture. At first, the scene before him defied comprehension. Snow had accumulated in thick drifts against his doorstep, and nestled within the frozen mound lay a small bundle of fabric. Something stirred within the wrappings, something undeniably alive. Then amber eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with a silent plea that made his breath catch in his throat. An infant, but not human. Marcus's pulse stuttered as he absorbed. The tiny, delicate form curled within the blankets. The child's skin held the deep indigo hue of twilight, her miniature fingers ending in small, pearl-like claws. A subtle luminescence seemed to emanate from her flesh, barely visible in the porch light's glow, as though she carried fragments of dying starlight beneath her skin. When he finally lifted his gaze, he noticed the figure standing beyond his doorway, half concealed by the swirling snow. She towered above him even in her exhausted posture, her lengthy obsidian hair plastered to her face by melted ice. Her angular features bore the weight of something far deeper than mere cold hunger. Terror, desperation carved into every line. She was Cytherean, one of the alien survivors stranded on Earth following the Great Conflict. Marcus had heard the stories, as everyone had. The war had concluded years ago, but its scars still festered. The Cythereans had once commanded respect across the galaxy, a civilization of philosophers and champions who had ruled among the stars. But when conflict erupted, they had lost everything. Their homeworld was nothing but cosmic dust now, their fleets reduced to scrap metal, and the survivors scattered throughout human territory unwanted, abandoned, slowly fading into extinction. The infant released another soft whimper, and Marcus's attention snapped back down. She had abandoned her child here on his threshold. His stomach churned as the implications hit him. How many doors had she approached? How many times had she been turned away with cruelty or indifference? How many nights had she begged for employment, for sustenance, for shelter, only to be denied? And now she stood here in the heart of a blizzard, regarding him as though he represented her final hope. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to think rationally. This wasn't his responsibility. He didn't know her, owed her nothing. The sensible course would be to close the door, pretend he'd seen nothing. Let someone else handle the situation. But then the infant shifted in her wrappings, her tiny fist curling against the cold, and something cracked inside Marcus's chest. Before he could reconsider, he bent down and lifted the child into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, far too little. The moment he drew her close, she stilled, as if instinctively recognizing warmth and safety. When he looked up, the woman, the mother, remained motionless. She was shivering violently, her threadbare clothing soaked through, her amber eyes fixed on his face with an expression too raw to decipher. Slowly, her gaze shifted to the child in his arms. She expected him to take the infant inside and leave her in the storm. Marcus cursed under his breath, running his free hand through his hair. "Hell," he muttered, then louder, "Get inside, both of you." The woman flinched. For an eternal moment, she didn't move. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear, as if this were some cruel trick, as if he might slam the door in her face the instant she took a step forward. But then she observed how he cradled her child, and something in her expression shifted. With slow, cautious steps, she crossed the threshold. Marcus sealed the door behind her, shutting out the storm. She flinched again subtly, but he caught it. The way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers twitched at her sides as if preparing for attack. He could only imagine what she had endured. "I won't harm you," he said, keeping his voice level. She didn't respond, just stood there creating puddles of melted snow on his floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Now that she was inside, he could see just how dire her condition was. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow from starvation. The deep indigo of her skin, which he knew from old broadcasts should have been rich and vibrant, appeared faded and lifeless. She looked as though she hadn't slept in weeks. The infant made a soft sound against his chest, and Marcus instinctively adjusted his grip, accommodating her slight weight. She nuzzled against him, her breathing steadying. He sighed. "Are you hungry?" The woman inhaled sharply. He watched her throat work, her jaw clenching. There was a long pause, pride warring with survival. Then, finally, she whispered, "Yes." The house felt stifling compared to the frozen wasteland outside. The sudden temperature change made the woman shudder as melted snow dripped from her garments onto the wooden floor. Marcus noticed how her arms remained locked around herself, fingers digging into her tattered sleeves as if trying to hold herself together physically. He had witnessed exhaustion before, but this was something else, something deeper. More hollow dot, she remained frozen near the entrance, amber eyes darting between him and the infant still nestled against his chest. Uncertainty flickered in her gaze. She didn't trust him yet. Marcus couldn't blame her. "Come," he said, keeping his tone even and careful. He nodded toward the couch, the only piece of furniture in his modest living room that looked remotely comfortable. "Sit. You need warmth." For a moment, he thought she wouldn't comply. But then, almost reluctantly, she moved forward. Her legs trembled beneath her, and when she reached the couch, she collapsed onto it as if every ounce of her strength had been drained. Marcus exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his damp hair. He wasn't skilled at this, the whole comforting stranger situation. Hell, he wasn't even sure what he was supposed to do now. He had let her inside, but what came next? The infant stirred against him, releasing a soft whimper, and the sound seemed to jolt the woman back to awareness. She sat up straighter, eyes locking onto the child with sharp intensity. "She needs nourishment," she whispered, her voice raw with urgency. Her accent was light but unmistakable. The syllables softened in a way unique to the Cytherian language. Marcus blinked, then nodded. "Yeah, you too." He turned toward the kitchen before she could protest, setting the infant down carefully in her bundle of blankets on the couch beside her mother. The little one made a small noise, but feeling her mother's warmth nearby, she settled. The kitchen was a chaos of half-used ingredients and dishes that Marcus had never excelled at organizing. He wasn't much of a cook most nights. Dinner consisted of whatever he could assemble with minimal effort. But now wasn't the time for laziness. He reached for a can of broth, twisting off the lid before pouring it into a pot. It wasn't elaborate, but it was hot, and more importantly, it was something he could prepare quickly. He placed it on the stove, turning the heat high, then grabbed half a loaf of bread from the counter. It was slightly stale, but it was food. It would have to suffice. When he turned back, he found the woman watching him from the couch. Her eyes flickered to the broth, then to the bread in his hands. There was no hiding the way her throat worked, the way her fingers curled against her lap as if resisting the urge to reach out. "Not much," he admitted, setting everything on the small table before her, "but it's warm." She hesitated for half a second, then reached forward, her hand shaking as she tore off a piece of bread and brought it to her lips. The moment the food touched her tongue, something inside her broke. She ate like someone who hadn't seen a meal in days, maybe longer. Each bite was swift, desperate, her body too starved to care about anything other than filling the aching void in her stomach. Marcus said nothing. He just settled back in the chair across from her, letting her eat in silence. When the broth was gone, when the bread had been reduced to crumbs, her breathing was unsteady, not from exhaustion this time, but from something dangerously close to relief. Then, as if remembering why she had been so frantic in the first place, she turned to the bundle on the couch. The infant had begun to stir again, her tiny hands twitching, a soft cry bubbling up from her throat. The woman reached for her without hesitation, scooping her up into her arms, cradling her close. She murmured something in Cytherian, a low, melodic sound, a language Marcus didn't understand but recognized instantly as something intimate, something ancient. Then she hesitated. Marcus saw it in the way her body tensed, the way her grip on the child tightened. Her amber eyes darted toward him, and for the first time since stepping into his home, she looked afraid. Not afraid of him, afraid of what she was about to do. Marcus frowned, about to ask what was wrong, but then he saw the way she shifted, the way she adjusted her hold on the child, and then he understood. She was going to feed her. Of course, it should have been obvious. But the moment realization dawned, so did her discomfort. He could see it in the way her shoulders hunched, the way she turned slightly as if trying to shield herself. Her people were different, more reserved. He had read somewhere, back when the war was still fresh, back when humanity was still trying to understand the Cytherians, that they treated certain acts with more delicacy, more reverence. This wasn't just nourishment, it was something sacred. And now she was in a stranger's home with no privacy, no dignity left to protect. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his jaw. He cleared his throat. "I can give you some space if you want." The woman inhaled sharply. She hesitated, then gave a quick, barely perceptible nod. Marcus stood, making his way toward the hallway. He paused just before rounding the corner and glanced back. She was already turning away, curling in on herself, the infant nestled securely against her chest. He saw the way she ducked her head, the way she closed her eyes, not just from exhaustion, but from shame. And Marcus suddenly hated that she felt that way. He wanted to say something, to tell her it was fine, that she had no reason to feel embarrassed, but the words wouldn't come. So instead, he did the only thing he could. He gave her space. The house had never felt so occupied. For years, Marcus had existed alone, his days predictable, his nights quiet. He had constructed a life of solitude, not necessarily by choice, but because it was easier. Easier to keep his head down, easier to avoid unnecessary complications. But now there was someone else here. Two someones, to be exact. The soft crackling of the radiator filled the room, the only sound accompanying the slow, steady breaths of the sleeping infant on the couch. The mother, Lyra, she had told him, sat across from him at the kitchen table, her amber eyes flickering between him and the warm bowl of broth in front of her. She had eaten once already, but it hadn't been. Enough, he could see it in the way she gripped the spoon, in the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly each time she brought it to her lips. She was still starving, still holding herself back as if afraid this kindness might vanish at any moment. Marcus didn't rush her. He just sat there, watching the way her shoulders had begun to lose some of their tension, the way color, though still faint, had started to return to her deep indigo skin. She was exhausted, not just from hunger or cold, but from something heavier. He didn't need to ask to know that she had been carrying the weight of survival for far too long. "You don't have to ration it," he said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. Lyra looked up sharply, as if she had forgotten he was there. His gaze dropped pointedly to the broth. "Eat, there's more." She hesitated, fingers tightening around the spoon. Her expression was unreadable, but after a long pause, she nodded and took another bite, this time without the cautious restraint of someone expecting to be told to stop. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her. Now that the immediate urgency had passed getting her inside, getting food into her, ensuring the infant was safe, he was left with questions. She had told him her name, but that was all he knew. He had no idea where she had come from, how long she had been out there, how many doors she had knocked on before ending up at his. She must have seen the questions in his eyes because she swallowed, setting the spoon down carefully before speaking. "I tried to find shelter," she said, her voice soft, distant. 4 days. Her gaze dropped to the table, fingers curling into the fabric of her sleeves. No one would open their doors. Some turned me away before I could even ask. A pause, then quieter. Some were not so kind. Marcus's stomach twisted. He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. "I went to a shelter," she continued. "They claimed they had no space. I could see it was a lie." Her voice was flat, almost resigned. "They looked at me, at her eyes flickered toward the sleeping infant on the couch, and they told me to leave." Marcus clenched his jaw. He wasn't naive. He knew how humans treated Catherian refugees. It wasn't open warfare anymore, not like before, but the hatred hadn't disappeared. It had just changed shape. Now it was quieter, woven into laws and policies. And looks of disgust. "How long?" he asked. "How long have you been on the streets?" She hesitated. "Weeks, maybe more." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, something small but unmistakable. Time has blurred. Marcus let out a slow breath, rubbing his face. Weeks. In the middle of winter. With an infant, Jesus, his gaze drifted back. To the baby Kea, he reminded himself. She was so small, so fragile. She stirred slightly in her sleep, one tiny hand curling into the fabric of the blanket. It was a miracle they had made it this far. Lyra must have noticed the way he was looking at her child, because she exhaled softly. "She is strong," she murmured, almost as if to reassure herself. Marcus nodded. "She has to be." Silence settled between them again. This time, it wasn't quite as heavy. Lyra took another slow bite of broth, the tension in her shoulders easing not completely, but enough that she no longer looked like a cornered animal waiting for the trap to spring. After a while, she spoke again. "You asked why I left her." Marcus met her gaze. "I didn't. You were thinking it." She wasn't wrong. She swallowed, amber eyes darkening with something he couldn't quite name. "I had no choice," she whispered. I hoped, if I left her somewhere safe, if someone kind found her, she would have a chance." She exhaled shakily. "A better one than I could give her." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He wasn't sure what to say to that. "But you did not leave her," she continued, her voice quiet but certain. "You brought her inside, and you let me in too." Marcus ran a hand through his hair. "I guess I did." She studied him, tilting her head slightly. "Why?" It was the same question she had asked before, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just about food or shelter, it was about trust. About intentions. Marcus sighed, leaning forward, resting. His forearms on the table. Because you needed help, he said simply, and because no one else did. Lyra looked away. For the first time since she had stepped into his home, she looked at him without suspicion, without fear. She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it meant something. She finished the rest of her broth. When she was done, Marcus stood and walked toward the hallway. She tensed slightly, but he just disappeared into a closet, returning. A moment later with a folded bundle of fabric. "Here," he said, setting it on the chair beside her. "They're clean. Might be a little big, but at least they're warm." She stared at the clothes for a long time, then slowly reached out, running her fingers over the fabric. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Marcus cleared his throat. "There's a spare room down the hall. Nothing fancy, but it's better than the couch. You can use it." Lyra inhaled sharply. She blinked, as if struggling to process the words. Then, finally, she nodded. Marcus grabbed the empty bowls and turned toward the sink. "You should get some sleep," he said over his shoulder. "You're safe here." When he glanced back, she was still looking at him. And for the first time, she looked like she believed him. Morning light seeped through the curtains in muted slants, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The house was quieter than Marcus had expected. He had barely slept. Even though he had offered Lyra the spare room, he had half expected her to be gone when he woke up. He wouldn't have blamed her. He was a stranger, a human, and the world had given her every reason to run. But as he stepped into the hallway, he could hear the faintest sound coming from the living room, soft rhythmic breaths, the quiet rustle of fabric. She was still here. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, his eyes settling on the couch. Lyra was asleep, curled protectively around her child, her long dark hair cascading over the blanket like spilled ink. Kaya was nestled against her chest, small fingers clutching at the fabric of her mother's borrowed shirt. Something about the sight made Marcus hesitate. He had seen Lyra as many things over the last 24 hours, desperate, cautious, starving, but never at peace. Even now, in the safety of his home, there was a tension in her body, as if she was ready to wake up and fight at a moment's notice. He wasn't sure why, but it unsettled him. Marcus cleared his throat just loud enough to make his presence known without startling her. Lyra stirred instantly, her amber eyes snapping open, alert and wary, scanning the room before they settled on him. A flicker of recognition softened her expression, but only slightly. "You stayed," he said, more as an observation than a question. Lyra blinked, shifting carefully so she wouldn't wake Kaya. "I did." Her voice was still rough from exhaustion, but it held a quiet certainty. Marcus nodded, stepping into the kitchen. "You want coffee?" She hesitated. "I do not know what that is." That caught him off guard. He paused mid-reach for the pot, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Wait, seriously? You've never had coffee?" Lyra lifted a brow. "Is that strange?" Marcus huffed a small laugh, shaking his head. "Not really. Just means you've been missing out." She watched as he poured the dark liquid into 2 mugs, the steam curling in lazy ribbons. He slid one across the counter toward her. She hesitated before reaching for it, wrapping her fingers around the ceramic hesitantly, as if expecting it to burn. Marcus took a sip, nodding for her to do the same. Lyra brought the cup to her lips, inhaling cautiously before taking a small sip. She stilled, her brow furrowing slightly, and for a moment Marcus thought she was going to spit it out. Then she swallowed. "Bitter," she murmured. He smirked. "Yeah. It grows on you." Lyra hummed but said nothing more, cradling the cup between her hands as if it were more valuable for its warmth than its taste. The quiet stretched, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. Marcus leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. Now that she was a little more settled, he could see things he hadn't noticed before: the faint scars along her arms, the sharp collarbones that hinted at months of malnourishment, the way she sat straight-backed, poised, but with a subtle edge of restraint, as if even rest was something she didn't allow herself too often. He wasn't sure why, but it made something in his chest tighten. After a moment, he set his cup down. "You were a soldier, weren't you?" Lyra went completely still. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't have to. The way her fingers tightened around the mug, the slight shift in her posture, he had hit a nerve. Finally, she exhaled through her nose. "I was," Marcus nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. The Cytherians had fought fiercely during the war, but most of them hadn't been given a choice. It had been survival for them, just like it had been for humanity. He hesitated before asking, "Did you lose someone?" Lyra's gaze flickered, and for the first time, he saw something raw beneath the guarded exterior. "Everyone," she said simply. Marcus clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what answer he had expected, but the weight of that single word settled between them like a stone. He had known the war had been brutal. He had seen the aftermath in news reports, in images of destroyed cities and mass graves on planets that no longer had names. But knowing something and hearing it, feeling the grief in the way someone spoke, were two different things. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Lyra inhaled, as if about to respond, but before she could, Kaya stirred against her chest, releasing a soft whimper. Immediately, Lyra's entire focus shifted. Her expression softened, her hand instinctively moving to stroke the baby's back in slow, soothing circles. Marcus watched as the child calmed, pressing herself closer to her mother's warmth. Lyra exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Then, to his surprise, she looked back up at him. "You lost people too," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus hesitated, but then he nodded. Yeah, there were things he didn't talk about, names he didn't say aloud. But even if he had, he wasn't sure Lyra would have recognized them. They had been enemies once. Now they were just two people sitting at a kitchen table, haunted by the same ghosts. Lyra studied him for a moment longer. Then she did something that caught him completely off guard. She reached across the table. It was a small movement, hesitant, but unmistakable. Her fingertips barely brushed against the back of his hand, a fleeting contact, one she could have easily retracted if she had changed her mind. But she d-idea in single quotes T. Marcus didn't move. He didn't pull away. He just let her touch linger, barely there but significant in a way he couldn't quite explain. Cytherians didn't touch humans, not unless they had to. Which meant this moment, this choice was something more. Lyra withdrew her hand as quickly as she had offered it, wrapping her fingers around her mug once more. But the air between them had changed. The walls weren't entirely gone, but they had cracked. And for the first time, Marcus wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just helping her. Maybe she was helping him too. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence. Marcus had been out in the back alley, dumping a bag of trash into the bin, when he noticed the eerie stillness of the street. Normally, even in this part of the city, there was something to break the quiet, the distant hum of traffic, the muffled voices of neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, the occasional stray cat knocking over a garbage lid. But now there was nothing. Marcus frowned, his breath clouding in the frigid air. His fingers tightened around the edge of the bin as a strange unease settled into his chest. Something felt off. Slowly, he turned back toward the house, his senses sharpening. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped onto the porch, glancing toward the street. The shadows between the buildings stretched long and dark in the dim glow of the streetlights, but he didn't see anything. Still, the feeling didn't go away. He shook it off and stepped inside, locking the door behind him. The warmth of the house was in immediate contrast to the frozen air outside, and for a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to relax. He shrugged off his coat and ran a hand through his hair, listening to the faint sounds coming from the living room. Lyra's quiet voice speaking in soft Cytherian syllables to Kaya. The baby cooed in response, and something in Marcus's chest tightened at the sound. They had been here for nearly a week now. In that short time, his house had transformed from a quiet, empty space to something almost resembling a home. It was a dangerous thought, one that he knew better than to indulge in. But then Lyra would do something small, fold the blanket neatly after using it, hum an unfamiliar melody while rocking Kaya to sleep, and Marcus would find himself wondering how he had ever lived in such silence before. He stepped into the living room, leaning against the doorway. Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor, cradling Kaya in her arms. The baby blinked up at her, tiny fingers reaching for the strands of dark hair that fell over her mother's shoulder. Lyra's amber eyes softened as she gently brushed a hand over Kaya's forehead, whispering something in her native tongue. It was a small, intimate moment, one Marcus knew he had no right to intrude upon. Still, when Lyra lifted her gaze and met his, she didn't look annoyed to see him there. If anything, there was something almost calm about her expression. "You're back," she murmured. Marcus smirked. "Didn't go far." She nodded, adjusting Kaya's blanket. "It's quieter than usual outside." Marcus's smirk faded slightly. He hadn't said anything about it, but she had noticed it too, that same unnatural stillness. "Yeah," he said, "I noticed." Lyra studied him for a moment, then looked down at Kaya. The baby had already begun to drift off again, her small breaths even and warm against her mother's chest. Daniel hesitated before pushing off the doorway and stepping into the room. "You should get some rest too," he said. "You haven't been sleeping much," Lyra exhaled slowly. "I don't sleep deeply," she admitted. "Not anymore." Marcus didn't press. He had seen the way she startled awake at the slightest noise, how she instinctively positioned herself between Kaya and the door even in sleep. She had spent too long living in fear. He wasn't sure she even knew how to rest anymore. But before he could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. The sound was sharp, precise. Marcus's body went rigid. Across from him, Lyra stiffened, her entire posture shifting from exhaustion to alertness in an instant. Kaya stirred against her, but Lyra held her close, her amber eyes snapping toward the front of the house. Marcus moved first, stepping toward the door as casually as he could, though every muscle in his body was tense. He peered through the peephole. Two figures stood outside. Men. They weren't wearing uniforms, but that didn't mean anything. Their posture, the way they stood with their hands just barely out of sight, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a friendly visit. Marcus glanced back toward the living room. "Take Kaya and go to the back room," he said quietly. Lyra's grip on the baby tightened. "Who is it?" "Don't know, but I don't want to take chances." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. She rose smoothly, cradling Kaya against her, and disappeared down the hall without another word. Only when he heard the quiet click of a door closing did Marcus turn back to the entrance. He unlocked the door and opened it just enough to step halfway into the frame, blocking the view inside. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice even. Man closest to him had short cropped hair and a hard, weathered face. His companion was younger, thinner, but something about him felt twitchy, like he was waiting for an excuse to act. "You read?" the older one asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, He crossed his arms and leaned against the door frame. "Who's asking?" The younger man glanced toward the window. "You got a guest staying with you?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "What?" The older man exhaled through his nose. "Look, I'll keep this simple. We know a Kitherian woman's been seen in this neighborhood. A woman with a baby. Now, we're not saying you have her, but if you did, it'd be in your best interest to tell us." Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears. There was no good way to answer. He knew exactly what happened to Kitherian refugees when they were caught. Best case, they were deported, dumped on some overcrowded station where disease and starvation did the rest. Worst case, they were never seen again. He forced himself to give a dry chuckle. A Kitherian in this neighborhood? You think one of them would last 5 minutes around here? The younger man smirked. You'd be surprised what people are willing to risk. Marcus shrugged. Haven't seen anything. Now, unless you got a warrant, I'd appreciate it if you got off my porch. The older man narrowed his eyes, but after a beat, he nodded once. If you see anything, he said, his voice laced with warning, you let us know. Marcus didn't answer. He just watched as they turned and walked back down the street. Only when they were out of sight did he let out a slow, steady breath. Then he locked the door and turned back toward the hallway. Lyra was already there, standing in the shadows. He hadn't even heard her move. They will come back, she murmured. Marcus met her gaze. I know. She swallowed. If they find me, they will take Kaya. His fists clenched. He knew that silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Marcus exhaled. They won't find you, he said. I won't let them. Lyra's eyes widened slightly. Something flickered in her expression, something Marcus couldn't quite name. But whatever it was, she believed him. And for now, that was enough. Marcus didn't sleep that night. After the men left, he had checked the locks twice, then positioned himself in the living room, close enough to hear if anyone came near the house. He had done his best to reassure Lyra, but the truth was, he wasn't sure what would happen next. They had been lucky this time. The two men hadn't pushed harder, hadn't forced their way inside. But Marcus knew that luck wouldn't hold out forever. They would come back, and when they did, they wouldn't be asking questions. Lyra hadn't slept much either. She had stayed in the back room with Kaya, keeping the baby close, her body rigid with tension. He had seen the way she held Kaya tighter than usual, as if she expected someone to rip her child from her arms at any second. By morning, a decision had been made. We need to leave, Lyra said. Marcus had expected it, but hearing the words still sent a sharp, unwanted pang through his chest. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Where? Lyra hesitated. She looked down at Kaya, who was still asleep, her small fingers curled around a fold of her mother's shirt. I do not know, she admitted, but we cannot stay. Marcus leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. They'll be watching the roads, he said. The transport hubs too, she nodded. There are places Kitherians go, safe places. If I can get to one of them, I will find help. Marcus studied her, his jaw tightening. And what happens if you don't? Lyra didn't answer. That was the part she hadn't figured out yet. He rubbed the back of his neck. If we run, we need a plan. You can't just disappear into the city and hope for the best. Lyra shifted, adjusting. Kaya in her arms. I did not expect you to come with us. Marcus froze. The way she said it matter of fact made his stomach twist in a way he hadn't expected. She had already accepted that he wouldn't follow, that this was where their paths split. It shouldn't have bothered him. He had known from the moment he let her in that this wasn't permanent, that one day she and Kaya would leave and things would go back to how they were before, quiet, simple. But now the thought of that silence felt wrong. Marcus exhaled through his nose. I didn't say I wouldn't go. Lyra's head snapped up, her amber eyes widening slightly. Marcus, I'm not letting you do this alone. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. You don't know the city like I do. You don't know who to avoid, which streets are watched. You need someone who does. Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Instead, she just looked at him, really looked at him. Marcus wasn't sure what she was searching for, but after a long moment, she let out a quiet breath. All right. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something heavier, something unspoken. She had spent so long surviving alone that accepting help wasn't easy. But this time, she wouldn't fight it. They didn't have much time. Marcus grabbed an old backpack from his closet, stuffing it with essentials, food, water, extra clothes. He didn't have much in the way of weapons, just an old hunting knife and a battered pistol he hadn't fired in years. It would have to do. Lyra worked quickly too. She packed lightly, only taking what Kaya needed: blankets, a spare set of clothes, a small pouch filled with something Marcus didn't recognize. She moved with precision, her military training showing in the way she double-checked everything without wasting time. It wasn't until they were nearly ready to go that Marcus hesitated. Once they walked out that door, there was no coming back. His life, the quiet, predictable routine he had built, would be gone. He had spent years keeping his head down, staying out of trouble, making sure the war remained nothing more than a distant memory. And now he was throwing it all away for them. For her. He should have been scared. Instead, he felt alive. Lyra stood near the door, Kaya tucked securely against her chest. She looked at him, waiting. Marcus took a slow breath, then nodded. Let's go. They moved through the city like shadows, keeping to the alleys, avoiding main roads. Marcus led the way, guiding them through the back streets he knew best, watching for patrols, for anyone who looked twice in their direction. Lyra stayed close, her grip firm around Kaya, her amber eyes scanning every corner. They didn't speak much. There was no need to. Hours passed. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of the city. Lyra paused, glancing back the way they came. The skyline stretched behind them, its lights flickering against the dark sky. This had been her prison for so long. Now she was finally leaving it behind. Marcus studied her. Where to now? She hesitated, then met his gaze. There's a ship, she said. Transport. It leaves for the outer colonies in 2 days. If we can reach it, we'll reach it, Marcus said. Lyra blinked, then nodded. They started walking again. The road ahead was uncertain. They had no guarantees, no safety net. But for the first time, they weren't running alone. They were running together. 2 days later, under the cover of night, a small cargo ship lifted off from a hidden launch site deep in the frozen countryside. Inside, a human man sat beside a Kitherian woman, a sleeping child nestled between them. For the first time in a long time, neither of them had to look over their shoulder. They had escaped. The twin suns of Kepler Prime rose over rolling emerald hills, casting a golden glow across the small settlement that stretched along the river's edge. The planet was nothing like the frozen city they had left behind. Here, the air was warm, the sky a soft violet hue, and the scent of wildflowers drifted lazily on the breeze. It had been nearly 6 months since they arrived, and for the first time in years, they weren't running anymore. Marcus stood at the edge of a small wooden deck, staring out at the landscape that was slowly becoming home. This settlement was a mix of humans and Kitherian refugees, traders, settlers looking for a fresh start. There were no patrols, no wary glances in the streets, no doors slammed in Lyra's face. Here, no one cared where you came from, only where you were going. Behind him, the sound of quiet laughter reached his ears. He turned, leaning against the railing, watching as Lyra and Kaya sat on a blanket spread across the grass. Kaya had grown stronger since they arrived. She was no longer the frail, quiet infant Marcus had first held in his arms that night in the snow. Now she was full of life, crawling, babbling, reaching for everything with her small hands. Lyra sat cross-legged. Beside her, amber eyes soft with warmth as she let Kaya tug at a strand of her long dark hair. The baby squealed happily, shaking her tiny fists, and Lyra laughed a real, unguarded laugh that Marcus still wasn't used to hearing. She was different here, lighter. She no longer carried the weight of survival on her shoulders, no longer flinched at every unfamiliar sound. The sharpness in her gaze had softened into something gentler, something hopeful. Marcus smiled to himself before pushing off the railing and making his way over. The moment Kaya saw him, her amber eyes lit up and she let out an excited chirp, a Catherian sound that Marcus had learned meant happiness. She reached for him instantly, small fingers grasping at the air. Marcus chuckled, scooping her up effortlessly. "You're getting heavy, kid." Kaya babbled in response, pressing her face against his chest, her tiny hands grabbing at his shirt. Lyra watched them, her smile lingering. "She likes you," Lyra said. Marcus smirked. "Yeah, well, I am pretty likable." Lyra rolled her eyes, but there was amusement in her gaze. Marcus adjusted Kaya in his arms, watching as the baby reached up, touching his face with curious fingers. "You think she'll remember any of it?" he asked. Lyra's smile dimmed slightly. "The cold? The fear?" She shook her head. "No, she was too young." Marcus exhaled, relieved. "Good." Lyra shifted closer, resting a hand on Kia's back as the baby curled against him. "She will only remember this." Daniel looked at her, at the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, at the way her amber eyes shone with something softer than before. She wasn't just talking about Kaya. This was her life. Now not running, not hiding. Just living. Marcus reached for Lyra's hand, threading his fingers through hers. She squeezed back without hesitation. They had found home. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt like theirs to shape. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers through the air as the twin suns continued to rise, painting the sky with light. A new dawn. A new beginning.